The evening air nipped at Daniel's fingers as he fumbled with his daughter's costume in the school parking lot. The stars were just beginning to peek through the twilight sky, and the elementary school's windows glowed warmly against the growing darkness. Inside his old station wagon, 10-year-old Lila sat perfectly still, her script clutched tightly in her small hands. "Hold on, sweetie," Daniel said, adjusting the ribbon in her hair for the third time. "It's just a little crooked." His normally steady hands trembled slightly as he worked with the delicate fabric. Lila continued whispering her lines under her breath, her eyes fixed on the pages before her. "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks." She paused, biting her lower lip. "Dad, what if I forget everything?" Daniel's heart squeezed at the worry in her voice. "You won't," he assured her, though his own stomach was doing somersaults. "You've practiced so hard. You know these lines better than Shakespeare himself." This earned him a tiny smile, but he could see the anxiety still swimming in her eyes so much like her mother's. Sarah would have known exactly what to say right now. She always had the right words, the perfect gesture, the magical way of making everything okay. Instead, here he was, a mechanical engineer trying to tie a perfect bow in his daughter's hair. The ribbon slipped through his fingers again, and he muttered under his breath. "Here, Dad," Lila said softly, reaching up to help him. "Like this." Together, they fixed the ribbon, their fingers working in clumsy harmony. The school parking lot was filling up quickly now. Other parents led their costume-clad children toward the building, their voices carrying across the asphalt. Daniel checked his watch and felt his pulse quicken. "We should head in," he said, closing the car door and offering Lila his hand. She took it, her small fingers cold against his palm. As they walked toward the building, she continued her whispered rehearsal, her free hand gesturing dramatically to an invisible audience. Inside, the gymnasium had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs faced a makeshift stage, complete with heavy curtains borrowed from the high school drama department. The familiar smell of floor wax and school lunch lingered in the air, mixing with the perfume and aftershave of dressed-up parents. Daniel guided Lila through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson from the PTA waved enthusiastically. Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store downtown, called out a greeting. The community had turned out in force for the spring play, as they did every year. Mr. Carter. Grace, Lila's teacher, hurried over to them. Her warm smile and calm demeanor seemed to ease some of the tension in Lila's shoulders. "Are we ready for our big moment?" Lila nodded, though her grip on Daniel's hand tightened. "The other children are gathering backstage," Grace said, gesturing toward a door decorated with paper stars. "Why don't you join them, Lila? You can do your final preparation together." Daniel knelt down to Lila's level, the way Sarah always used to do. "Break a leg, sweetheart," he said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "You're going to be amazing." Lila hugged him fiercely, her script crinkling between them. Then she hurried off to join her classmates, glancing back once with a nervous wave. "She'll be fine," Grace assured him, touching his arm lightly. "She's more prepared than any student I've ever had." Daniel managed a weak smile. Sarah used to run lines with her every night before bed. They'd act out stories together. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he felt the familiar ache in his chest. Grace's eyes softened with understanding. "Lila told me about that. She said you've been helping her practice too." "Trying to," Daniel admitted, "though I'm not exactly qualified for Shakespeare. Sometimes just being there is the most important part," Grace said gently, before being called away by another parent. Daniel found his seat in the front row, directly in line with where Lila would be standing. Other parents filled in around him, their excited chatter creating a steady hum of anticipation. He pulled at his collar, wishing he'd worn a different tie. Sarah would have picked out the perfect one. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. Grace stepped onto the stage, her face bright under the spotlights. "Welcome, everyone, to our spring production of A Midsummer Night's Dream," she began. "Our students have worked incredibly hard to bring you this beloved classic." Daniel barely heard the rest of her introduction. His eyes were fixed on the edge of the curtain where he knew Lila was waiting. He could picture her there, script still in hand, whispering her lines one last time. The curtain rose slowly, revealing a backdrop painted with twinkling stars and moonlit trees. The first few students took their places, reciting their lines with varying degrees of confidence. Daniel's heart pounded harder with each passing moment. Then Lila stepped out from the wings. She looked so small under the bright lights, her costume glittering softly. The ribbon in her hair, the one they'd struggled with earlier, caught the light perfectly. She moved to center stage, just as they'd practiced. Daniel leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping his knees. "You've got this, sweetheart," he whispered, though she couldn't possibly hear him. Lila opened her mouth to speak her first line. Nothing came out. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with panic as she stared out at the sea of faces. The silence stretched on, becoming heavier with each passing second. Someone coughed in the audience. Another student shifted uncertainly on stage. Daniel watched helplessly as the color drained from his daughter's face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He could see her hands trembling at her sides, the script long forgotten backstage. In that moment, looking at his daughter standing alone under those unforgiving lights, Daniel felt completely useless. Sarah would have known what to do. Sarah would have prevented this somehow. Sarah would have. But Sarah wasn't here. There was only him. Watching his little girl's moment of triumph transform into her worst nightmare. The silence in the auditorium grew deafening. The silence in the auditorium felt endless. Lila stood center stage, her small figure frozen under the harsh spotlight. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The thick curtains behind her seemed to dwarf her even more, and the sea of faces staring up at her blurred together in the darkness. Daniel's heart ached as he watched his daughter's cheeks turn a deep crimson. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill down her face. He could see her hands trembling, the script she held backstage now forgotten in the moment of panic. The quiet murmuring of the audience grew louder, parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering behind cupped hands. Without thinking, Daniel leaned forward in his front row seat. "In such a night as this," he whispered, just loud enough for Lila to hear. His voice was gentle but clear, carrying the words up to her like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Lila's eyes found his in the darkness. She blinked, a tear escaping down her cheek. "In such a night as this," Daniel repeated softly, nodding encouragement. This time, Lila's voice emerged, barely above a whisper. "In such a night as this, when the sweet wind did gently kiss the trees." Daniel continued, his eyes locked with hers. "When the sweet wind did gently kiss the trees," Lila echoed, her voice growing stronger. The trembling in her hands began to still. A few audience members noticed what was happening. The whispers changed tone, became softer, more wondering. Daniel kept going, feeding her the next line with unwavering patience. "And they did make no noise. And they did make no noise," Lila repeated, standing a little straighter now. Color still stained her cheeks, but the tears had stopped. Together, they moved through the monologue. Father and daughter finding a rhythm. Daniel would whisper each line, and Lila would follow, her voice growing more confident with each word. The audience fell completely silent, captivated by the unexpected duet unfolding before them. "In such a night as this," Lila continued, now speaking with growing assurance, her voice rising above her father's gentle prompts. Her hands had stopped shaking entirely, and she took a small step forward on the stage. Mrs. Peterson, Lila's teacher, stood in the wings with her hands clasped to her chest, tears gleaming in her eyes as she watched. Other children, waiting for their cues, peeked around the curtain, mesmerized by their classmates' transformation. As they approached the final lines, Lila's voice rang out clear and strong through the auditorium. The spotlight caught the shine of unshed tears in her eyes. But now they were different, tears of triumph rather than fear. Her face had softened into a smile, and she stood tall, every inch the character she was meant to portray. Daniel continued whispering, though she barely needed him anymore. His own vision blurred as he watched his daughter bloom before his eyes, her confidence building with each passing moment. The stage lights caught the ribbon in her hair, the one he'd struggled so hard to tie perfectly, and made it shimmer like a crown. When Lila delivered the final line, her voice soared through the auditorium without any prompting at all. "In such a night as this." The words hung in the air for a moment, strong and clear and perfect. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the audience erupted in applause. Daniel jumped to his feet, clapping harder than anyone else, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. All around him, people were wiping their eyes and smiling through tears. Lila beamed down at her father from the stage, her face glowing with pride and joy. In that moment, Daniel felt something shift inside him. A weight he'd carried since Sarah's passing seemed to lighten just a little. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right as a father. The applause continued to thunder through the auditorium. Parents who had been whispering just minutes before were now standing, their faces bright with emotion. Several elderly audience members dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and even some of the younger siblings who had been fidgeting throughout the show sat transfixed, caught up in the magic of what they'd just witnessed. Lila took a small bow, just as they'd practiced at home. The spotlight caught the tears of joy streaming down her face now, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. Her eyes never left her father's as she straightened up, her smile radiant with a newfound confidence that transformed her whole being. Daniel stood there clapping, his own tears falling freely now. In this perfect moment, he felt like he'd finally done something Sarah would have been proud of. He'd helped their daughter shine, not by being perfect, but by being present, by supporting her in his own way. For this brief, shining instance, it felt like enough. The auditorium buzzed with excited chatter as families gathered backstage after the performance. Children in colorful costumes darted between proud parents, their voices echoing off the walls. The smell of grease paint and hairspray hung in the warm air. Lila found herself surrounded by her classmates, their faces bright with genuine admiration. Sarah, her best friend, wrapped her in a tight hug that made both girls giggle. "You were amazing," Sarah squealed, bouncing on her toes. "Even when you forgot the lines, you didn't give up." Mrs. Peterson, the drama teacher, made her way through the crowd. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with warmth as she approached Lila. "My dear, what a performance!" She knelt down to Lila's level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You showed such courage up there, both you and your father." Daniel stood a few steps back, watching the scene unfold. His daughter's face glowed with joy, a sight he hadn't seen in months. When Lila caught his eye, she broke away from the group and ran to him. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist. Her voice held a mix of pride and relief that made Daniel's throat tight with emotion. "You sure did, kiddo," he managed to reply, pulling her close. The familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with the theatrical makeup she wore. "You were incredible up there." As the crowd began to thin, Daniel helped Lila gather her costume pieces. She carefully folded the long blue dress she'd worn as the lead character, while he collected the prop flowers and script from the dressing room. That's when he heard them. Two mothers standing just around the corner, their voices low but clear enough to reach his ears. "Poor girl," one said, the words dripping with sympathy that felt more like judgment. "If her mom were alive, she wouldn't have needed saving." "I know," the other replied with a heavy sigh. "Sarah tells me she's so quiet in class now. It's such a shame." Daniel's hands froze on the costume bag he was zipping. The words hit him like a physical blow, settling heavy in his stomach. He forced himself to keep moving, to keep his face neutral as Lila bounced back to his side with her backpack. The drive home was quiet, broken only by the soft whir of the heater and Lila's occasional humming from the back seat. Streetlights swept across the dashboard in steady rhythm, but Daniel barely noticed. Those words kept echoing in his mind. If her mom were alive. At home, he went through the motions of preparing dinner, warming up leftover lasagna, pouring milk into Lila's favorite cup with the purple butterflies. The kitchen felt too big, too empty, despite Lila's animated presence at the table. And then when Jenny forgot her line too, I didn't feel so bad. Lila chatted between bites, her fork gesturing in the air. "Mrs. Peterson says sometimes the best performances have mistakes because they're more real that way. Do you think that's true, Dad?" "Mm-hmm." Daniel nodded, pushing his food around on his plate. He tried to focus on her words, but his mind kept drifting back to the mother's conversation. "Dad? Are you okay?" Lila's question snapped him back to the present, her forehead wrinkled with concern, an expression so like her mother's that it made his chest ache. "Just tired, sweetie." He forced a smile. "Big night, you know." After dinner, he helped Lila with her bedtime routine. She brushed her teeth while telling him about next week's science project. He braided her hair the way YouTube tutorials had taught him, not as neatly as her mother used to do, but Lila never complained. "Good night, Dad," she said as he tucked the covers around her. Her words, meant to comfort, somehow made the doubt dig deeper. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, leaving her door cracked open just the way she liked it. Downstairs, Daniel's feet carried him to the living room mantel. Among the framed school photos and vacation memories sat the picture he both loved and dreaded looking at. His wife, Catherine, laughing at something off camera. Her eyes crinkled at the corners, her honey brown hair caught in a breeze. It was taken just months before the accident, when they'd thought they had all the time in the world. He picked up the frame, his thumb brushing across the glass. The house felt heavy with silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. "Am I enough?" he whispered to the photograph, his voice barely audible. Catherine's frozen smile offered no answers, no reassurance. The doubt that had been planted by those whispered words now bloomed fully in his chest. How could he ever fill the void she'd left? How could he give Lila everything she needed when he felt so incomplete himself? He stood there, holding the photograph, feeling the weight of single parenthood pressed down on his shoulders. The simple act of whispering lines at a school play had felt like a victory just hours ago. Now it seemed like proof of his inadequacy, another moment where he'd had to improvise, to patch together a solution that wasn't quite right, wasn't quite what Lila deserved. The clock ticked on, marking time in a world that had kept moving even when theirs had stopped 2 years ago. Daniel carefully set the photograph back in its place. Catherine's smile still warming the room, still watching over their family, still leaving him wondering if he could ever be enough for their daughter. The evening after the school play, Daniel stood in his kitchen, stirring a pot of spaghetti while lost in thought. The whispered comments from those mothers still echoed in his mind, but something else nagged at him too, the way Lila's eyes had lit up when they worked together during the play. He glanced at his daughter, who sat at the kitchen table doing her math homework, her pencil tapping against her cheek. "Hey, kiddo," Daniel said, testing the pasta with a fork. "I was thinking." Lila looked up, brushing her dark hair from her eyes. "About what, Dad?" "Well," he drained the pasta, steam rising around his face. "Remember how we did those lines together yesterday? That was kind of fun, wasn't it?" A small smile crept across Lila's face. "Yeah, it was." Daniel grabbed 2 plates from the cabinet, his movements deliberate as he formed his next words. "What if we made it a thing? You know, practice different plays and stuff while we eat dinner?" Lila's eyes widened. "Like turning the table into a stage?" "Exactly." Daniel served the spaghetti, adding extra meatballs to Lila's plate just the way she liked it. "We could try different characters, maybe make up some voices. Can we start tonight?" Lila bounced in her chair, her math homework forgotten. Daniel pulled out his chair and sat down, trying to hide his relief at her enthusiasm. "Why not?" He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn copy of Peter Pan he'd borrowed from the school library during his lunch break. "I thought we could start with something fun." Lila giggled as Daniel cleared his throat dramatically. He opened the book and began reading Captain Hook's lines in an outrageously gruff voice, waving his fork like a sword. "Pan, show yourself, you cowardly boy." Spaghetti forgotten, Lila jumped right in, raising her voice to a confident crow. "Here I am, you old codfish." Their kitchen filled with laughter as marinara sauce dripped onto the tablecloth, neither of them caring about the mess. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized was there. The next evening they tackled The Wizard of Oz. Daniel surprised himself by knowing most of the Cowardly Lion's lines by heart, making Lila collapse in giggles when he added a shaky vibrato to "If I Only Had the Nerve." As the days passed, their after-homework routine became sacred. Math worksheets and spelling tests gave way to dramatic readings and silly voices. They worked their way through fairy tales, classic plays, and even some of Lila's favorite movies. Sometimes they'd act out entire scenes, using kitchen utensils as props and chairbacks as costume changes. One evening, while performing a scene from Alice in Wonderland, Daniel noticed something different about Lila's voice. The tremor that had always been there when she performed was fading, replaced by a growing confidence. She stood straighter, spoke louder, and even added her own flourishes to the characters. "Off with their heads," she proclaimed as the Queen of Hearts, wielding a wooden spoon like a scepter. Her voice filled their small dining room without a hint of hesitation. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was his daughter, blooming right before his eyes. Not because he was perfect, not because he knew exactly what to do, but because he was trying, because they were finding their way together. The kitchen became their stage, the dining room their theater. Sometimes they'd push the furniture against the walls to make room for more elaborate performances. Daniel found himself looking forward to these evenings as much as Lila did. The house, which had felt too quiet for so long, now echoed with their shared laughter and made-up songs. One night, after a particularly spirited rendition of Little Red Riding Hood, with Daniel playing both the grandmother and the wolf, they sat amid their usual dinner mess, scripts scattered between half-empty glasses of milk and bread crusts. Lila traced her finger along the edge of her plate, her expression turning thoughtful. "Dad?" "Yeah, sweetheart. This is fun," she said softly. "Like, really fun. We never did stuff like this before." Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. "No, we didn't, I think." Lila hesitated, then looked up at him with those eyes so much like her mother's. "I wish Mom could see us." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it was different now, not as sharp, not as lonely. He reached across the table and took Lila's small hand in his. "She does, sweetheart. She does." The wooden pews of First Baptist Church creaked as people shifted in their seats, waiting for Pastor Thompson to finish his announcements. Daniel sat next to Lila in their usual spot, third row from the back. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn hymnal in his hands. And finally, Pastor Thompson's voice boomed through the small sanctuary. "We're excited to announce our first Community Talent Night fundraiser." He smiled broadly, his round face beaming. "All proceeds will go to the Children's Hospital downtown. We're looking for performers of all ages, but we especially want to showcase our young people's talents." Mrs. Bennett, Lila's drama teacher, turned around from her seat 2 rows ahead and caught Lila's eye. She gave an encouraging nod and mouthed, "You should do it." Daniel felt Lila stiffen beside him. He glanced down to see her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her Sunday dress. The school play incident was still fresh in his mind, and he could feel his stomach tighten at the thought of Lila performing alone. After the service, Mrs. Bennett made her way through the crowd to their pew. "Lila, dear," she said warmly, "I have the perfect piece for you. A beautiful monologue about a young girl's first winter snow. You'd be wonderful." Daniel opened his mouth to politely decline. But before he could speak, Lila surprised him. "Can I think about it?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Bennett smiled. "Of course. Just let me know by Wednesday." She squeezed Lila's shoulder and moved on to greet other parishioners. The drive home was unusually quiet. Daniel kept stealing glances at his daughter in the rearview mirror, trying to read her expression. As they pulled into their driveway, Lila finally spoke. "Dad, I want to do it." Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Sweetheart, are you sure? There's no pressure. Nobody expects you to—" "I know," Lila interrupted, her voice stronger than usual. "But I want to prove I can do it by myself." She met his eyes in the mirror, her jaw set in a way that reminded him so much of her mother. Inside their small kitchen, Daniel busied himself making lunch, his mind racing. As he spread peanut butter on bread, he tried again. "You know, there are lots of other ways to help with the fundraiser. Maybe we could bake something. Or, Dad." Lila's voice was quiet but firm. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looking suddenly older than her 10 years. "I need to do this. Please?" Daniel set down the knife and looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Behind the nervousness in her eyes, he saw determination. The same determination he'd seen in her mother whenever she'd set her mind to something. He took a deep breath. "Okay," he said finally. "But we're going to practice until you know this piece backwards and forwards." Lila's face broke into a wide smile, and she rushed to hug him. "Thank you, Dad." Over the next few days, their evening routine transformed. After dinner, they would clear the coffee table from the living room, creating a makeshift stage. Daniel sat in his armchair, script in hand, while Lila performed. "Remember to project your voice," he'd remind her. drawing from distant memories of his high school drama class. Imagine your words reaching the back row. Lila would nod seriously. Start again, her voice growing stronger with each attempt. They worked on her posture, shoulders back, head high. They practiced her timing, marking places to pause for effect. Daniel even dug out an old music stand to serve as a podium, helping Lila feel more grounded as she performed. Some nights were harder than others. There were moments when Lila's confidence wavered, when the memory of freezing on stage would creep back in. During these times, Daniel would sit beside her on the couch, sharing stories about times he'd been nervous but pushed through. Did you know, he told her one evening, that your mom was terrified of public speaking? But she gave the most beautiful speech at our wedding. She said, fear just meant it mattered. The night before the talent show, their living room glowed warm in the lamplight. Lila stood straight and tall behind the music stand, wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she'd picked out for the performance. Daniel sat in his usual spot, script unopened in his lap. He didn't need it anymore. He knew every word by heart. Lila took a deep breath and began. Her voice filled the room, painting pictures of swirling snowflakes and crystal-covered trees. She moved with grace, her gestures natural and confident. The little girl who had frozen on stage weeks ago was transformed. As she delivered the final lines, Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes. He blinked them back and broke into enthusiastic applause. That was perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect. Lila ran to him, and he pulled her into a tight hug. When he finally let go, he gently kissed her forehead. Tomorrow, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You'll shine. The school gymnasium had transformed for the community talent night. Twinkling lights hung in swooping arcs across the ceiling, and hand-painted banners with Community Talent Night decorated the walls in bright colors. The usual smell of rubber balls and sneakers was replaced by the scent of fresh cookies and coffee from the snack table near the entrance. Daniel sat in his familiar spot in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The metal folding chair felt harder than usual beneath him, and his tie seemed to constrict with each passing minute. Around him, the bleachers and rows of chairs were packed with familiar faces from church, school, and around town. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery chatted with the librarian 2 rows back, while Pastor Thompson settled into his seat near the middle, program in hand. The stage, usually just a raised platform at one end of the gym, now bore black curtains and proper stage lights. Daniel watched as Mr. Roberts, the music teacher, adjusted the microphone stand one last time. His eyes kept drifting to the wing of the stage, where he knew Lila was waiting. The lights dimmed, and Principal Martinez stepped up to the microphone. Welcome, everyone, to our first annual Community Talent Night fundraiser. We have quite a show for you tonight. We have quite a show for you tonight. We have quite a show for you tonight. And there was not talent night handed night talent night. We have quite a show for you tonight. We have quite a show for you tonight. We have quite a show. Daniel barely heard the rest of the introduction. His attention was fixed on the stage entrance, where Lila now stood waiting for her cue. She wore her favorite blue dress, the one her mother had bought her last Christmas, and her dark hair was neatly pulled back with a matching ribbon. In her hands, she clutched her script, though Daniel knew she had memorized every word. When Principal Martinez called her name, Lila walked to center stage with small, measured steps, just as they had practiced at home. The spotlight found her, and Daniel could see her take a deep breath, squaring her shoulders the way they'd rehearsed. She stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and began. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the gymnasium. The day I discovered my grandmother's attic was the day everything changed. Pride swelled in Daniel's chest as he watched his daughter deliver each line perfectly. Her gestures were natural, her timing impeccable. She had chosen a piece about family memories, and the audience leaned forward in their seats, caught up in her storytelling. The old trunk creaked as I lifted the lid, Lila continued, her confidence growing with each word. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper as delicate as butterfly wings, lay my grandmother's wedding dress. That's when it happened. Don't mess up this time. A boy's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. Need Daddy again? The words seemed to hover in the air. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the audience, followed by several sharp shh sounds and a teacher's stern. "Tommy!" But the damage was done. Lila's voice faltered. Her next line died in her throat as her eyes went wide with hurt. Daniel saw the moment her confidence shattered. It was like watching a glass vase topple in slow motion. Her lower lip trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. I, she stammered into the microphone. Daniel half rose from his seat, ready to rush to her aid. But before he could move, Lila turned and fled the stage. Her script fluttered to the floor behind her like a wounded bird. The audience erupted in murmurs. Principal Martinez hurried to the microphone, calling for order, but Daniel was already pushing his way past knees and feet, heading for the backstage door. His heart hammered against his ribs, and his throat felt tight with anger. At the boy, at himself, at the unfairness of it all. He found her in the prop room, curled up in a corner between a rolled-up backdrop and a stack of chairs. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and her carefully arranged hair had come loose from its ribbon. "Lila," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Sweetheart, maybe they're right," she choked out between sobs. "Maybe I can't do anything without Mom." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Lila's quiet crying and the muffled sounds of the talent show continuing in the gymnasium. He reached out to touch her shoulder but stopped, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air. In that moment, all his doubts crashed over him like a wave. Every whispered criticism, every sideways glance from other parents, every moment he'd felt inadequate since his wife's passing, it all seemed to crystallize in his daughter's tears. His silence felt like failure, heavy and absolute, weighing him down as he knelt there on the dusty floor of the prop room, unable to find the words to heal his daughter's broken heart. Backstage was dim and quiet, the only sounds being Lila's muffled sobs and the distant murmur of the waiting audience. Daniel knelt beside his daughter, who had crumpled onto an old wooden chair next to the costume rack. Her small shoulders shook as she pressed her hands against her face, trying to hide from the world. "Sweetheart." Daniel reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly over her shoulder before finally settling there. The touch was gentle, almost timid. His throat felt tight, watching her cry bringing back memories of countless nights when he'd felt just as lost trying to comfort her. "I can't go back out there," Lila whispered between hiccups. "They're all laughing at me. They think I'm stupid." Her voice cracked on the last word, fresh tears spilling between her fingers. Daniel shifted, his knees protesting against the hard floor. The old metal folding chair creaked as he leaned against it, trying to find the right words. Behind them, the stage curtain rustled softly, and whispers from the audience drifted back. He could make out the concerned voices of teachers trying to maintain order, but the damage was already done. "They're not all laughing," he said softly, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Lila just shook her head, her dark hair falling forward like a protective curtain. "I miss Mom," she choked out. She would have known what to do. She always knew exactly what to say to make everything better. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, feeling tears burning behind them. All the doubt and fear he'd been carrying since that terrible day 2 years ago seemed to crash over him at once. His hand trembled on Lila's shoulder. "I miss her too," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "So much." He had to pause, gathering his courage for what he needed to say next. "And I've been so scared, Lila." She lifted her head slightly, peeking at him through her fingers. Her face was red and tear-stained, but there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. "You're scared?" she asked in a small voice. Daniel nodded, wiping quickly at his own eyes. "Every single day. I've been terrified that I could never be enough for you without Mom." The admission felt like ripping off a bandage, painful but somehow relieving. She was so good at all of this, the school events, the emotional stuff, knowing exactly what to say. "I always feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark." Lila lowered her hands slowly, hiccuping slightly as she looked at her father. The backstage shadows played across her face, making her look both younger and older than her 10 years. "But," she started, then stopped, sniffling. "But, you always seem so sure about everything." A weak laugh escaped Daniel. "I'm a pretty good actor too, it turns out." He shifted to sit beside her on the chair, which protested under their combined weight. "The truth is, I worry all the time that I'm not doing things right. that I'm not being the parent you need. That's how I feel about performing, Lila admitted quietly. Like I'm never doing it right. You know what I've realized, though? Daniel gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, just like her mother used to do. Love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be present. Lila's brow furrowed slightly as she processed this. What do you mean? I mean, Daniel chose his words carefully, that maybe it's okay that I'm not as graceful as Mom was, or that you sometimes get scared on stage. What matters is that we keep trying. That we're here for each other. A long moment of silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the gymnasium, a chair scraped across the floor. The sound seemed very far away. Lila's hands twisted in her lap. But what if I mess up again? Then we'll handle it together, Daniel said firmly. He turned to face her fully, taking her small hands in his. They were cold and still trembling slightly. What if we go back out there together? Lila's eyes widened with alarm. You mean, on stage? Daniel nodded. Not me saving you this time. Just us, side by side. I'll sit right next to you while you do your monologue. I won't say a word. I'll just be there. Can we do that? Lila asked uncertainly. Won't people think it's weird? Maybe, Daniel admitted. But I don't care what they think. I care about you. He squeezed her hands gently. What do you say? Lila bit her lip, looking toward the stage curtain. Her hand squeezed his back, seeking strength. She was still trembling, but there was something else in her expression now, a tiny spark of courage trying to catch fire. I'm still scared, she whispered. Me too, Daniel replied honestly. But sometimes, being brave means doing something even when you're scared. And you know what? I think that's what Mom would have told us both. At the mention of her mother, Lila's eyes welled up again, but this time the tears didn't fall. Instead, she took a deep, shaky breath and nodded slowly. Together? She asked, her voice small but steady. Together, Daniel confirmed, standing up and helping her to her feet. He brushed off her dress and straightened her ribbon with careful hands. Just like everything else. You and me, kiddo. They stood there for a moment, father and daughter in the shadows of the backstage area, holding onto each other's hands like lifelines. The audience was still waiting beyond the curtain, but for that brief moment, they existed in their own little world of shared courage and imperfect love. Daniel squeezed Lila's small hand as they emerged from behind the heavy stage curtains. The harsh spotlight made him squint, but he felt his daughter's grip tighten, anchoring him to this moment. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent, so quiet he could hear the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights above. He cleared his throat, surprised by how dry it felt. Excuse me, everyone. His voice echoed slightly in the large space. Lila would like to try her monologue again, if you'd be willing to give her another chance. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Some showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few, the ones that mattered most, showed genuine encouragement. An elderly woman in the front row nodded firmly, her silver hair catching the light. Next to her, Lila's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, gave them both a warm smile. Even the pastor, standing at the back of the room, raised his hand in a subtle gesture of blessing. Daniel turned to Lila, whose cheeks were still damp with tears but whose eyes now held a glimmer of determination. Remember what we practiced, sweetie. Just like in our living room. He made his way to the edge of the stage, letting go of her hand. Instead of returning to his seat in the audience, he settled himself on the corner of the platform, legs dangling slightly. Close enough to support, far enough to let her shine on her own. The wooden stage felt rough beneath his palms as he steadied himself. Lila took 3 small steps to center stage, her patent leather shoes making soft tapping sounds against the floor. She smoothed her blue dress, the one her mother had bought her last Christmas, and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her script, but her chin lifted with purpose. The Garden of Memory, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel found himself holding his breath, willing strength into her small frame. She glanced at him quickly, and he nodded, just as they'd practiced at home. When I was very young, she continued, her voice growing stronger, My grandmother taught me about flowers. The words began to flow more naturally now, like a stream finding its path. She said every bloom tells a story, if you know how to listen. Daniel watched as his daughter's shoulders relaxed, her gestures becoming more natural. The audience leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the gentle cadence of her voice. Even the boy who had heckled her earlier sat quietly, his face showing something like regret. The roses, Lila continued, stood tall and proud, just like my grandmother. Her voice carried clearly now, filling every corner of the gymnasium. But it was the forget-me-nots she loved best. Tiny blue stars scattered in the grass, refusing to be forgotten. Daniel felt his chest tighten as she delivered these lines. They hadn't discussed it, but he knew why Lila had chosen this particular piece. The forget-me-nots in their backyard had been her mother's favorite flowers. As Lila continued her monologue, her confidence grew with each word. Her hands stopped shaking, and she lowered the script, knowing the words by heart now. Her voice carried the story of the garden, of memories preserved in petals and leaves, of love that blooms year after year. And now, she said, approaching the final lines, whenever I see those little blue flowers, I hear my grandmother's voice in the garden. Her eyes met Daniel's, and in that moment, they both knew she wasn't just talking about her grandmother anymore. Some things, you see, never really go away. They just bloom in different seasons. The last words hung in the air for a moment, perfect and complete. Daniel felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. Pride swelled in his chest until he thought it might burst. The audience exploded into applause. They rose to their feet in waves, first Mrs. Peterson, then the elderly woman, then entire rows at a time. The sound was deafening in the gymnasium, echoing off the walls and high ceiling. Someone whistled sharply in appreciation, and several people called out, "Bravo!" Daniel clapped until his hands hurt, not caring that his tears were flowing freely now. He watched as Lila's face broke into a radiant smile. Not the shy, uncertain one she'd worn in recent months, but a full, confident beam that lit up her entire being. It was her mother's smile, he realized, but it was also uniquely Lila's. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. Parents who had been whispering criticisms earlier were now wiping their own eyes. The boy who had heckled her was clapping too, his head bowed slightly in what looked like shame. Daniel's heart felt so full it ached. Here was his daughter, standing tall and brave, having found her voice not despite their loss but somehow because of it. They had faced this challenge together, and in doing so, had discovered a strength neither knew they possessed. The ovation went on, a thunderous celebration of not just a well-delivered monologue, but of courage, of getting back up after falling, of a father and daughter finding their way together. The gymnasium buzzed with cheerful voices and warm laughter, creating a lively atmosphere that felt invigorating and alive. Parents gathered in small clusters, sharing proud smiles and gentle congratulations, their voices mingling in a comforting hum. Children darted between the folding chairs like little fireflies, their boundless energy undiminished even by the late hour. The overhead lights cast a soft glow over everything, illuminating the space with a magical warmth that transformed the worn basketball court into a scene straight out of a fairy tale. Daniel leaned against the wall near the stage, his tie loosened and hung loosely around his neck, allowing him to finally exhale after hours of built-up tension. He watched intently as Lila moved gracefully through the crowd, her delighted giggles ringing out as she accepted hugs and kind words from her classmates' parents. In that moment, her eyes sparkled with pure joy, and the tears from earlier had faded into nothingness. She looked so remarkably like her mother during moments like these, the same graceful way of accepting praise, the same gentle smile that brightened her entire face, bringing an involuntary smile to Daniel's own lips. Just then, Mrs. Thompson, Lila's teacher, approached and squeezed her shoulder encouragingly. "You showed such courage tonight, sweetheart. Coming back out there, that's what real bravery looks like," she said, her voice imbued with warmth and sincerity. Lila ducked her head shyly, yet Daniel could see her beaming underneath her embarrassment. Even Tommy, the boy whose cruel heckling had shattered her confidence, had come forward with his mother to offer an apology. Daniel watched from a distance, heart swelling with pride, as Lila accepted the apology with a quiet dignity that took great strength. He rubbed his tired eyes, grateful yet exhausted, feeling the weighted aftermath of the evening's emotional roller coaster. The wooden floor creaked beside him, and he turned to find an elderly woman standing there. She wore a powder blue cardigan that contrasted beautifully with her silver hair, which was neatly pinned back in a graceful bun. Her face radiated years filled with wisdom and kindness, and the mistiness in her eyes reflected a depth of understanding that instantly drew him in. "I hope you don't mind me saying so," she began, her voice soft but clear. "But I've been watching you and your daughter all evening. It's been a joy to see." Daniel straightened a little, suddenly feeling self-conscious under her compassionate gaze. The woman's gentle smile was disarming, melting away his apprehension. "Your wife would be proud," she continued, reaching out to pat his arm. Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he felt the familiar tightening in his throat, a physical manifestation of heartfelt emotion. "But more than that, your daughter will always remember you stood with her. That matters the most." The simple truth of her statement enveloped Daniel like a warm embrace. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted around the overwhelming gratitude and acknowledgement. All he could manage was a nod, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that were dangerously close to spilling over. The elderly woman seemed to sense the weight of his emotion. She gave his arm one final pat before slowly moving away, leaving him to absorb the profound impact of her words. He looked across the gym at Lila, who was now animatedly showing her script to her best friend Sarah. His daughter, brave, resilient, and blossoming stronger each day. Not despite his imperfect parenting, but perhaps because of it, because she knew, without question, that he would always be there beside her, unwavering and steadfast right when she needed him most. Gradually around them, the crowd began to thin. Parents collected their tired, happy children. Folding chairs were stacked neatly against the walls, and the once lively buzz of conversation gradually faded into a comforting hush. Mr. Jenkins, the janitor, began sweeping the floor, the soft, swishing sounds of his broom creating a rhythm in the quiet that accompanied their departure. "Ready to head home, sweetheart?" Daniel called out to Lila, who was still engaged in a final goodbye with the last of her friends, her joyful spirit still radiating. She turned to him, nodding enthusiastically as she gathered her script and the small bouquet of flowers someone had graciously gifted her. Her steps were slower now, the excitement of the evening gradually giving way to a palpable exhaustion. Daniel helped her into her light jacket, noticing how her eyelids fluttered, growing heavier as sleep beckoned her. Together, they walked through the double doors and stepped into the cool night air. The spring evening was clear and crisp, with stars twinkling overhead like tiny, distant diamonds scattered across an indigo blanket. The parking lot was mostly empty now, their old blue sedan sitting quietly under a flickering streetlight. Their footsteps echoed softly in the serene atmosphere, accompanied by the gentle rustle of the trees swaying in the light breeze. Without a single word exchanged, Lila slipped her small hand into his. Daniel looked down to find her smiling up at him, her eyes heavy with sleep but shining bright with contentment. That simple gesture, her small hand nestled comfortably in his, conveyed more than words ever could. It spoke of trust, of love, of the unbreakable bond between father and daughter that had weathered storms and emerged renewed. He squeezed her hand gently, and together they walked toward their car, their shadows merging into one on the pavement beneath the vast, starlit sky, ready to face whatever the world had to offer tomorrow together. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, painting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. The morning air carried the sweet scent of maple syrup and fresh coffee, mingling with the peaceful quiet of their small home. Lila moved around the kitchen table, carefully placing forks and plates while humming fragments of her monologue from the previous night. Her hair was still messy from sleep, and she wore her favorite weekend pajamas, the ones with tiny stars scattered across blue cotton. Daniel stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted to Lila, watching her confident movements with a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. The weight that had pressed against his shoulders for so long felt lighter, as if the previous night's triumph had lifted more than just their spirits. "Dad!" Lila called out, straightening a napkin with careful attention. "Can we put blueberries in some of the pancakes, like Mom used to?" The question didn't sting like it might have before. Instead, Daniel smiled, reaching for the container of berries in the fridge. "Coming right up, kiddo. Your mom always said blueberry pancakes were magic for breakfast." Lila grinned, bouncing on her toes as she finished setting the table. She was right. Everything feels magical this morning. She continued humming, the tune mixing with the sizzle of pancake batter hitting the hot griddle. As they settled into their breakfast, sunlight warming their shoulders, Daniel watched Leela drizzle syrup in careful circles. "You know," he said, cutting into his stack of pancakes, "I was thinking about maybe finding a community theater group. For both of us." Lila's eyes widened, fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Really? You'd do that with me?" "Why not?" Daniel shrugged, trying to hide his smile. "I've gotten pretty good at reading lines. Maybe it's time we both tried something new. Could we do funny plays?" Lila asked, excitement building in her voice. "Or maybe a musical. I bet you'd be great at singing, Dad." Daniel laughed, nearly choking on his coffee. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. My singing might clear the theater faster than a fire alarm." Lila giggled, the sound bright and clear like wind chimes. "Remember when you tried to sing at my birthday last year? Even Mr. Whiskers ran under the bed." "Hey now," Daniel protested, but he was laughing too. That cat has very particular taste in music. Their conversation drifted comfortably, jumping from school projects to funny memories to dreams of future performances. Lila described an elaborate play she wanted to write, complete with dragons and talking trees. Daniel listened, marveling at how freely she spoke now, how confidently she shared her ideas. "You know what Mom would say about the talking trees?" Lila asked, pushing her empty plate away. Daniel felt his throat tighten, but not painfully. "What's that?" "She'd say they need tap dancing roots," Lila declared, demonstrating with her fingers dancing across the table. They both burst out laughing, and Daniel realized something profound in that moment. The memory of his wife no longer felt like a shadow between them. Instead, it was a warm presence, something they could share and celebrate together. "Your mom always did have the best ideas," he said softly, reaching across to squeeze Lila's hand. "She'd be so proud of you, sweetheart. Of how brave you've become." Lila squeezed back, her small fingers strong and sure. "She'd be proud of you too, Dad. You're really good at being both now, like a dad and a mom together." Daniel blinked back sudden tears, touched by her simple wisdom. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," Lila declared, jumping up from her chair. "Can I go play outside? The weather's perfect for practicing my dramatic exits." Daniel chuckled, waving her toward the door. "Go for it. Just try not to scandalize the neighbors with too much drama." Lila dashed outside, her bare feet pattering across the deck. Through the kitchen window, Daniel watched as she spun in the morning light, arms spread wide, her laughter floating back to him like music. The sound filled their small backyard, pure and uninhibited, bouncing off the fence and mixing with birdsong. He stood slowly, gathering their breakfast dishes, and walked to the living room window for a better view. Lila had found her jump rope and was attempting to skip while reciting what sounded like a very theatrical version of "Mary Had a Little Lamb." "We're going to be just fine," he whispered, the words feeling more true than ever before. His eyes drifted to the mantel, where Sarah's photo sat in its familiar silver frame. Her smile seemed especially bright this morning, knowing and gentle. Daniel touched the frame lightly, a gesture that had become more blessing than grief. He smiled back at her image, understanding now that their little family wasn't broken or incomplete. They were whole, different than before, but whole nonetheless. Together. What do you think Daniel will say? Will his answer change everything for them? Click on the next video to find out what happens next. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. And tell us in the comments, what do you think Daniel's answer will be? I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story touched your heart, let us know how. Sometimes the smallest reflections spark the biggest connections. If you believe in stories that bring light, hope, and healing into the world, I invite you to subscribe and join this community. We're building something truly special together. And as you go about your day, remember this: you are seen, you are valued, and you are loved. Until next time, keep holding on to the hope that even in brokenness, beauty can bloom.